Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming back from lunch. So welcome to the Games and Not Games panel. My name is Jesper Juhl. I'm teaching and so on here at the NYU Game Center. On the panel we have Doug Wilson, who is a lead game designer and partner at Die Judefabrik, family things for Johann Sebastian Joust and other things, and he recently finished his PhD dissertation at the University of Copenhagen. Can we talk about your geographic stuff?
The what?
Your geographic stuff, like your movie?
Yeah.
So, and Doug is officially coming here to New York City. Annika Waern is a research leader in the Mobile Center at Stockholm University and a game studio director at Interactive Institute. Has a long career working in computer science and lately on pervasive games especially. The third panelist was originally Dan Pinchbeck from the Chinese room and one of the people behind here. Dan Pinchbeck couldn't come, so Matthew Weise graciously stepped in at the last moment. And Matthew Weise is a narrative designer at Harmonix and he previously worked at the Singapore MIT Game Lab. So the way it is, I think there's something that kind of happened recently, which I think it was kind of obvious that it would happen. So I think we're going to turn Doug's music down entirely. Which was, I think that there was a kind of time, there was a point in time some years ago where very little had been said about video games. We didn't have a lot of theory of video games. We didn't have a lot of books on how to design video games. And many people from, say, Chris Crawford to Eric Zimmerman to Annika, to myself, spent a lot of time discussing this question, like what is a game and how can we talk about this kind of thing, and this book was both out of curiosity and out of the need for having the conceptual and kind of tools that we needed to just talk about games in general and talk about game design. And we had things like the idea of formal abstract design tools and so on. And I think there was a lot of consensus that this was quite valuable, that this was something that kind of brought us somewhere. And in a way it was also kind of uncontroversial in some sense. If you recall, Will Wright described SimCity as being a software toy rather than a game with nothing, no kind of, this was kind of an uncontroversial statement, I think. But then recently I think there's been a bit of a backlash. So we have a lot of people saying that we shouldn't try to make something that is sort of stuck within the narrow confines of the term game, and perhaps we shouldn't care about whether something is a game or not. And Dan Pinchbeck, for example, made a strong statement about that at this year's GEC. You also have groups like Tale of Tales who will go to game events and present their not games and their manifestos about how one shouldn't make games. So I think this is this is where we are at this point in time. And so this panel is really about the house of Weise and of making, things that are either games or not games, or it's about this question of when should we really care about whether something is a game or not? When is that term useful and when is that a kind of straitjacket? How can do we make better games, or whatever we call them, with or without calling them games? Would it be easier to make something new if we didn't talk about games, or is games something that kind of helps us, this idea of games something that helps us go forward? And the structure of this is really that the three panelists each make a position statement. Then we have some brief discussion up here, and then we'll open it up to the floor. And so as our first presenter, let's welcome Doug Wilson.
I'm going to play some music from Proteus in the background, and you'll see why halfway. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, it's a little too loud. I'm Doug Wilson, and I want to start this talk off quick with a quote. It's a quote from, oh no, what happened? Okay, well, pretend that you didn't see the modification at the top, but the quote from TL is, "Play is situational and reliant not simply on abstract rules, but also on social networks, attitudes, or events in one's non-game life, technological abilities or limits, structural affordances or limits, local cultures and personal understandings of leisure. And I think this is a great way to understand play, because play is not just some kind of thing we can define really easily, but it's really messy and it's contextual and it has all sorts of like sociocultural aspects to it. And so what I want to kind of argue in this talk briefly is that we can say the same thing for the practice of game development as well. And so put more succinctly, I more and more these days view game development as sociocultural practice. And since we're at a conference called Practice, I really want to think about this word practice, which has a certain meaning in the academic backgrounds I come from, STS, sociology, HCI. And it's a little bit of a kind of a loaded term in those worlds, and I want to speak to that, the messiness implied by practice. Okay, so like oftentimes when we talk about game development, especially in the community of practitioners, we talk about it as like a craft or a profession, maybe a hobby, maybe the process of game development as artistic expression, and these are all well and good, and there's nothing wrong per se about any of these. Can you? It's a little too dark. No problem. Sorry about that. Great. Okay. Right. So there's nothing per se wrong with any of these perspectives, but I think oftentimes when we talk about game development as this like isolated thing, we're ignoring the like sociocultural messiness of game development. So going back to this idea of game development as a practice, as kind of living, breathing culture. So this is what I'm going to touch on really briefly with some concrete examples in this very brief talk. Of course, this all leads us to this question: how do we define game? Right? And this is one of like the world's most annoying questions on one hand, and so I apologize because I'm sure everyone in the audience is now like groaning. But I actually think this is like a really important question to ask too, and so I want to take kind of a weird shot at this question. Now, like again, thinking about how we often talk about the definition of game in both game studies and also in the community of practitioners. Games as systems or series of rules, game as kind of like definable object, games as a medium, maybe some sort of like longer academic definition. And so to answer this kind of messy question, I want to start with a subset, which is, okay, so instead of how do we define game, let's think about how do we define video game. So this is a question that I've kind of become intimately familiar with in the last 2 years, based on a game that I've made called Johann Sebastian Joust. If you've never played it, it's a game right now played with PlayStation Move controllers. There's no screen involved, and it's a motion control game where you don't want to move your controller too fast. Now, what's weird about this is that there's no screen involved. It's based entirely on the feedback from the light and from the rumble in the controller, and then the input is the accelerometer in the controller. And so, inevitably, as this game has gotten some attention in the media and so forth, you get some angry people on the internet going, well, come on, this isn't a video game, like there's no video involved. Therefore, by definition, is Johann Sebastian Joust a video game? And there's all these like weird threads on the internet with people kind of like debating whether this game is a video game. But from all those kind of theoretical discussions aside, what's amazing to me is that the game has been accepted by the video game community, right? So it's a game that's shown now at like video game festivals, at video game parties. It's a game done with video game technology, and I'm even talking to Sony now, and hopefully we'll be able to do that on their console. So this is like a game that's really whether or not it's a video game is very much become a part of like the video game world, the video game business, video game culture. This kind of all climaxed at GDC this year, where like kind of amazingly we won this kind of innovation award at this video game award show, right? Now, what I want to kind of flag really quickly is I'm not actually convinced that Johann Sebastian Joust as a game is very innovative at all, right? So there's tons of folk games and playground games out there that do like something very similar to Johann Sebastian Joust, at least in a mechanical sense. So here's a game called Lemon Joust. I didn't actually know about this game when I developed Johann Sebastian Joust, but as it turns out, there's a bunch of kind of classic folk games out there that are like somewhat similar to Johann Sebastian Joust. If we're going to call that game innovative at all, I think the most innovative work I did in the game was the framing work I did in terms of like integrating the game into video game culture, right? So like, for example, one of the reasons that I think Johann Sebastian Joust has gotten a lot of attention is because I did something with this weird controller that Sony made that people were really skeptical of, and this controller that hadn't really done so well. And so when people saw Johann Sebastian Joust, it was like, well, holy shit, you did something interesting with the Move controller, and that that caught people's attention, right? So that was very much like a contextual innovation, surprising people's expectations, right? But it was also kind of, socially, a lot of gamers, game developers, especially in the indie world, are like quite skeptical of motion-controlled games. And right, like Johann Sebastian Joust was maybe for some people an eye-opener, like, well, hey, actually, motion-controlled games can be fun. It's not just like wiggling a stupid Wiimote in front of your screen or something. And so it was that kind of like, based in the specific context of where we are with video games right now, the game took some people by surprise, right? So, thinking again about this question, how do we define video games, right? Like, I think what Johann Sebastian Joust has showed is that like we don't have to think about the word video so explicitly. It doesn't necessarily mean like video screens, right? It's actually kind of taken on a new meaning, like this just 5-letter term, VIDEO, kind of means something more complicated and different, which is something like it uses console game technologies, and it's part of this whole thing, scene culture or series of cultures that we call video games, but it's a much more kind of like constructed and social definition that's based on the world that I'm operating in as a self-identified video game developer, right? Okay, so with that lesson in mind, I want to then kind of go back to this question of how do we define this word game? So I have a really kind of cheeky answer to this question, which is this. And I fucking swear, I hope someday when you open up a dictionary and it says the word game, there'll be no words, it'll just be this fucking screenshot with this music playing in the background. Of course, this is it's a game called Proteus. It's still in alpha and beta, but you can actually go on the web and pre-order it right now. I'm playing the music from this game. It's by a composer called David Kanega. And the thing about Proteus is, for me, it was a completely mind-blowing experience. And for me, this is one of the most important video games ever made. Obviously, that's a really subjective judgment, but for me, it crystallizes so much of why video games are really meaningful to me and why video games are really important. And so, but what's so weird about Proteus is it's in kind of like the traditional definition of game, it's debatable whether or not this is even a game. And so again, people, on the internet or game conferences or whatever have this discussion, is Proteus a game? And so what Proteus is it's a procedurally generated musical island, and it's almost like an interactive screensaver where you walk around this island in different seasons, so fall, summer, spring, and not much happens. And in fact, there's not many stated challenges or goals. You kind of walk around this island, and I don't want to spoil too much, but you kind of slowly move through the seasons. The experience ends, there's kind of beautiful interactive sound and music, and you can discover little creatures running around the island. But that's it. There's no real points to collect. There's no challenges. It's not a very hard game. And so some people would argue, well, listen, I like Proteus, but can't we call it kind of like a new media art exhibition or a musical software toy or an interactive screensaver? And so for some people who have this more kind of traditional definition of game, Proteus is something different. And certainly we can imagine some alternative world, right, where Ed Key, who's the programmer behind Proteus, isn't really involved in this whole game scene. Instead goes and shows his game at museums and sells it like a screensaver. Right, like you could imagine Proteus at a museum installation as just some beautiful kind of audio-visual piece. The exact same object, the exact same code, very easy to imagine that in a very different sociocultural context. But what's happened and what I'm really happy about is the games community, all of us have kind of accepted Proteus into our midst, right? So here's Ed and David winning an award at the Indiecade conference in Los Angeles. More recently, they were nominated for an Independent Games Festival award this year. And so this is a game that's really been embraced by the gaming community. So, whether or not we want to call this a game, it's now kind of part of this whole gaming community. And I think that's, to me, because this has been such a moving experience for me, that's been a big victory for our community, that we've been open-minded enough to kind of accept this game into our midst. Because quite honestly, if Proteus isn't a game, then I don't want to fucking be part of the game development community. Another great example of this would be Dear Esther. I just wanted to give a shout out since Dan couldn't make it. For similar reasons, people debate kind of very vigorously whether Dear Esther is a game. But here's another example of Dear Esther is now on fucking Steam, and it has made like a truckload of money on that service, right? And like kind of the most gamery possible delivery mechanism we can imagine. And so, again, I would say, it's a big success of us that we've been able to incorporate these weird, like, semi-game things and just embrace them. Yes, Proteus. Yes, Dear Esther. They are games. We're going to give them game awards. We're going to sell them in games channels. And we're going to embrace them in our gaming world. Now, I want to contrast this with, I think, a big failure of kind of us and the gaming community, which would be interactive fiction, right? So I think I'm, as a fan of interactive fiction, I'm personally really bummed that that community seems so kind of separate and isolated from, especially indie games and, kind of the GDC community. And we don't even call them games, we call them interactive fiction, and yet these things are very game-like. They're interactive, you can complete or not complete them, there are puzzles, and so it's hard for me to, personally, to see how are these things not games. And yet, like, socially and culturally, there are no, as far as I know, interactive fiction games for sale on Steam or in, like, traditional indie game channels, or at least not as often as kind of whatever pixelated platformers you typically see. A concrete example of this would be, why is there no best writing category at the Independent Games Festival, right? Which I think is totally ridiculous, right? We celebrate best graphics, best sound, design, even best technology, and yet, like, writing, even though the written word is this really beautiful thing and is often a really important aspect of games and of human culture and media, is just totally, like, forgotten at this celebration and this festival of independent games. And it's no surprise, right, that we're kind of having trouble building those bridges to the interactive fiction community, because, like, they don't have the same opportunities as, someone like me who makes a more gamey game or a visual game to kind of get that recognition and to be accepted into our community. And so I think these are the stakes we're talking about when we're talking about the definition of game. Like, it is political, and I kind of want to leave you with this quote from one of my favorite HCI researchers, Paul Durish. He writes, "As technologists, our concern is not simply to support particular forms of practice, but to support the evolution of practice," right? So looking at this term game, again, I think it's really weird that people get so hung up on this, like, definition of, like, what's a game and what's not a game, right? Game is just a fucking 4-letter word. It's G-A-M-E, and we can kind of fucking define that however we want to define that, right? And so what I kind of want to encourage everyone in this room is that as game developers, or even press and game-interested people, part of our job, part of our role is imagining, and that's spelled wrong on this slide, which is embarrassing, but imagining and shaping futures, right? And I don't even just mean that in terms of the games that we choose to make, although that's really important, that's a part of this, but also the kind of people and the games that we support and that we stick up for, and the communities and collaborators and so forth that we're reaching out to, right? And this all gets back to this point that, like, game development is living, breathing culture. it's not just like a profession or this like isolated thing we do. It's a fucking practice. It's sociocultural practice. Yeah, that's my rant on games. So thank you.
Yeah, next up is Annika. Yeah, we do questions there.
I'm Annika Waern, and my background is primarily from the academics. I'm a basic games academics, been doing research in that area for a long time. I do some design as well. I'm also a LARPer, an active LARPer, and that sort of have flavored the way I look at game design and pervasive games design, and it's going to shine through in this talk today as well. So I think the reason I'm here, can you hear me? Should I stand here maybe? Yeah. This is better, yeah. So I think the reason I'm here is because in June this year, I went to the Nordic Digger Conference and I presented the second most scary presentation I've done in my whole life, which was on a definition of games. So I actually wrote one of those papers. And I had all the wolves in the audience, like Espen Arseth and Jesper Juhl and all of those people that really don't want to pose questions. I'm going to sort of do that argument here today, but it's going to take a different twist. So before I start to do that, I would like to say that game scholars don't do game definitions in the void. They do them for a purpose. So there are academic reasons for knowing what you're studying, like what is the limitations, what do we include in what we're studying in this subject, and that's one of the reasons. And the other reason is that you actually want to say something about why those things are interesting, what they have in common that you're going to focus your research on. So that's why these academic definitions keep popping up all the time. And another way to say the same is that there is a hidden agenda in those definitions. They aren't there to be generally applicable. Every definition has a purpose, and it's there to sort of show us into a corner where that particular person wants you to be. And I am no exception. So I'm going to start from one definition which I think by far is the best so far. And this is from Suit's book from the 70s, from the Grasshopper, where he, on the backside, this is actually not in the book in these works, but it's on the backside, saying that to play a game is the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. So this is actually not a definition of games, but it's about playing games. And this book everybody should read. This is like if you read one academic book on game design, this is the book to read. On game definitions, sorry, this is the book to read. And he has a longer definition as well, which is in the actual book. I'm going to skip that. But Suits had also a purpose. He had a hidden agenda, or not so hidden agenda. He was arguing against Wittgenstein, because Wittgenstein has said that you can forget it, you can't define games, basically. Whatever definition you come up with, it's going to be wrong. And Suits wanted to prove that that wasn't correct. So Suits wanted to prove Wittgenstein wrong. And this is Wittgenstein, we don't need to read Wittgenstein. But there is one thing that's kind of strange with Suit's definition, and that is that he didn't talk about make-believe at all. He has a couple of places where he does in his book, actually. And when he does that, he does an extremely poor job. Like, he says something like, yeah, they are actually games but they have as their goal to go on forever, which could actually be a way of defining the sandbox games that we've been looking at today. But that's not at all what's going on in make-believe. And it's kind of strange that Suits does this. Because if you look back in history and look at all, even older dead male white men exercising their privilege to be able to talk about games rather than do them and make a living out of it. The earlier scholars were all very much focused on make-believe. So the children's psychologists would look into how children would make a stick into a horse, for example. Hausinger talks a lot about make-believe. Calloway makes it a very big part of his definitions. So make-believe has been there as a very strong factor before, and actually more or less defined what people thought play would be. So how could Suits throw it out, and did he do the right job when he did that? And I don't think he did. I think that, so I'm here to argue that fiction and make-believe is an essential part of all games, not just children's free-form play. That's my argument. And of course I have a hidden agenda. So my hidden agenda, can you see those pictures? They're really cool actually. So this is my hidden agenda. My hidden agenda is that these pictures have more in common than the fact that there are three men and one woman holding a rifle in both cases. But one of them is Left 4 Dead and the other one is a LARP. It's a role-playing game. And both of them rely quite heavily on their fictional content, which is one of the reasons why they look the same. The photos look the same. But this is a photo, that's a screenshot. So let's start from rules. So, yes, games have rules. They have at least some rules, and one of the things we know about rules is that they create intrinsic meaning. There is a meaning generated from the fact that you follow the rules in a game. And this is what Suits talk about when he says that if you go out and just hit a ball with a pin or a stick, that's a pretty meaningless thing to do. If you do the same in a game of golf, it's going to be very deeply meaningful. And the reason it's meaningful is because you have the rules of golf there. And potentially, we could think that this is all that a game is. This could be the whole meaning of a game, but it's not. And one reason for that is that we don't know all the rules. I think that when we heard the presentation on Journey yesterday, I think that was a really good example of how the rules aren't actually built into the game, but generated in the play activity. And this is common for many sandbox games, that they have the ability of generating those kinds of play activities that have their own rules that are actually not encoded in the game. Then we have the old split up in between the rules that are there, given by the game, and all the implicit rules around the game. A colleague of mine, Carl Bergström, he looked at board games. And what he did was he tried to figure out what are all the different kinds of implicit rules that people talk about. So he interviewed a lot of board game players. And he came up with at least 3 classes of implicit rules that people would apply in a board game session. And loads and loads and loads of examples of rules that people either had argued or had said that this is a really important rule because if it isn't followed, we're going to get into a fight, etc. So my conclusion is that you could probably continue to do this. You could probably continue to develop your understanding of implicit rules forever. And you could probably find new rules in a sandbox game like Journey forever. So I don't think that we can talk about all rules of a game. At least not if we go beyond the hard-coded single-player computer games. So no, we don't know all the rules of a game. And then it's sort of meaningless to talk about that it's the rules that generate the game, if we don't know them. Another thing is, are game rules precise? So even if the rules aren't complete, it could be that the rules of a game are so precise that whenever a rule trigger, you know exactly what's going to happen. And that's not true either. Implicit rules, of course, are imprecise by necessity. And then you have all the rules that you negotiate. So you might have defined that in all of these situations, we're going to play slightly different than for the rules. And then comes a borderline case, and then you have to start negotiating that rule again. And then you could also say that in computer games, we have all these rules that are precise because they're coded. But actually, they will do different things every time because they contain a probability. And if that's true, then is that really a precise rule? I'm not sure. And finally, we have the fact that even the coded precise rules that we put into computer games have unforeseen consequences. And it's really up to us when those start to emerge to decide whether they could actually be seen as a feature or a misfeature or bug. So no, rules aren't precise either. And now we can start to think, okay, how could the meaning of a game be generated by the rules if they are incomplete and imprecise? So in the paper I presented in June, I made it simpler. I said that I don't care what kind of rules you have, as long as you have some explicit rules. And by explicit, I mean that they are either negotiated or written into a book or coded into a program, but they are there. They're given somehow. But those rules do not need to be complete, and they don't need to be precise. And now, friends, now we can get role-playing in. So, this girl, this woman, has as her rule to play a cat. Can you see what she's doing? So what do cats do? One of the things they do is they play with yarn. So what she's doing right here is that she sits on the floor and she's playing with a ball of yarn, stretching it and making it do things. She has not a lot of rules here. She has one thing to go on, and that is that cats play with yarn. So that's what she takes and she plays it out, role-playing. So if we think that the meaning of games are not solely generated by its rules, its explicit rules, then I think that you can see several different sources of meaning. One is the social thing, the magic circle that enables us to establish and frame the rules that we actually make explicit. We have all the game conventions and genres and player expertise that brings in a certain layer of meaning as well. But what I want to talk about is that the fiction itself creates references for the rules that you use in shaping the game activity and its meaning. So it represents, it establishes representational and metaphoric references that we use to shape the game activity. Just as the little simple rule of playing a cat generated her behavior in the picture. So, if we look at the role of fiction and make-believe, I think that in computer and most board games, fiction is there to complete the rules dramatically, as we said in the dinner the other day. I thought that was a wonderful way of expressing it. So, at the component level, there is, at the rules-based, at the lower level in the game, fiction completes what the rules mean. But it also forms an overall shell that guides our engagement in a game. If we're playing Left 4 Dead, we know something about what we're up for due to the fictional content of it. And finally, fiction has the role of enabling story making. We can tell stories about the game sessions we've been playing, and we can tell stories around games in the form of fan fiction, etc. In role-playing games, it comes even deeper. So in role-playing games, fiction completes the rules, period. The rules are not there until the fiction is in place. Sometimes they can be really vague, like in the example of playing cat. Sometimes the rules have a lot of stats and changes and so on. But when they trigger, it's based on fiction. It also has the role of enabling a consistency, a certain level of consistency in what we improvise within the game. So role play and story making completes fiction. So for role-playing games, they have a great advantage in that the fiction doesn't need to be that complete from start, but players will add to it. Players will complete it and add stuff to this fiction. So I'm going to end now. Perfect timing. Wow. I'm going to end with my hidden agenda again. My real hidden agenda is that I want to use photos in my presentations rather than screenshots. So I'll do that. This is a cool photo. And this is another really cool photo that I want to be able to use when I talk about games. This one as well. Thank you.
I got it. That's fine. That's fine. No, I'm not right now. Maybe in a bit. Okay, hello. I found out I was going to be a speaker when I got in on Friday, and I saw speaker on my name tag. So I have been thinking about this for a day, and I've come up with something. So I don't have a PowerPoint or anything, but when I was asked to fill in for Dan Pitchback, I realized that I had worked on something that could be considered a not game when I was at MIT. I work at, as Jesper said, I work at Harmonix now as a narrative designer, and I'll talk a little bit about how that connects with my previous work, which was at MIT, where I was doing experimental narrative design. And one of the things that I worked on was this game called The Snowfield, which I was the project lead on. And it was a student game. It got into the IGF Student Showcase last year. And we could just show, I've just got a clip of it here, so we can probably put the lights. This is the trailer, so we won't get deep into it, but it should give you some idea. And press the button. Okay. You have sound? No. Oh, okay. And how's that? Okay, yeah, we got it. Okay, we're fine. Okay, super short trailer, but it'll give you at least some kind of like visual audio concept of what the game is. And basically it was a game where you are a soldier in World War I who is freezing to death in the aftermath of a battle, and that's the game. So if you've ever read the short story To Build a Fire, it's like that, the game. And what we did is we began with it as an experiment in emergent narrative. So the idea was that we'd have all this complicated AI stuff. That didn't really come together, so we ended up with this very bare bones game that at the end of the day was actually very similar to like a Tale of Tales game, like The Path, where basically you just walk around. And so this fits a little bit into, there was some discussion about this game when it got a little bit of press about, whether it's a real game or not. And the thing that made it a game for me is that it did actually have a win state. So when we were making the game, as we scaled things back, it was supposed to be very deeply systems oriented with all these AI characters and stuff. But eventually it became a game where there were pretty much only two systems. There was this kind of heat-cold thing where there was a fire, you could put fuel in the fire, and then if you didn't put enough in, you would just eventually freeze to death. But then we actually had this win state where you could go out and find these other soldiers and bring them back to the fire, and you would kind of get a different ending depending on how many of them you saved, more or less, although everybody kind of froze to death at the end. It's like, do you want to die happy, sort of, or die not happy at all? So the happy ending was freezing to death with people. And but what's interesting though is that as we were getting near the end of the project, like many of the projects at Gambit, it was a team of students. Many of them were gamers and very interested in games. And I think that in the last week, as an emergency tactic, we came up with this goal system for the game because some people were getting very depressed. They were like, oh, this isn't a game. You just walk around and die. That's not very interesting. Some people actually thought it was very interesting, and I think that if we hadn't implemented that goal win state to the game, it would have been more like a Tale of Tales game or more like Dear Esther. So we ended up implementing it, but it's still, a lot of people didn't find it. It's not like presented very clearly, so it kind of ends up functioning like a not game anyway. So that's the experience that I had at MIT working in that type of game. And then after I left MIT, and now I'm working on harmonics, I'm working on an unannounced project which I can't talk about, but I can say that even in a bigger company that's working on commercial products, I do think that increasingly this idea of like what is a game and what is not a game is becoming important, because I think for me, the question is a question of the audience broadening, and I thought what Doug was saying was really interesting about, the not games need to be embraced by this community with this distribution in order to, that itself has validity. But the thing that's interesting to me about the whole not games, I don't know if you call it a movement, is that to me it really points to a broadening of the audience of whether we call this games or whatever we call it. Something like Dear Esther, to me, you could argue that that's, from a gamer's perspective, that is like, the narrative design is the narrative design of BioShock, right? You walk around and you hear stuff. But you could argue from a gamer's perspective, that's BioShock with all the good parts taken out, but from a non-gamer's perspective, it's the opposite. It's BioShock with all the bad parts taken out, right? It's like all the stupid parts where you have to shoot things, and it just like lets you directly access the reason that you were there in the first place, which is to experience the mood, experience the story, and explore that kind of like narrative-rich space. And I do think that the term game, I completely agree that it is socially constructed, and I think that for practitioners who want to use precise language, I mean, if you're an auto mechanic, there's a reason you say transmission and not, that thing under the car. So I think that to some level that's important, and I think that precise language for people using it in a precise way, we need to maintain that in communities of practice. But I think that on the other hand, it's also completely true. That doesn't invalidate at all that it is socially constructed, and that a lot of what makes these things games is that they have a particular distribution, they get presented in particular communities, et cetera, et cetera. And I think these things, at least for me, these things coexist with each other. I mean, it's okay for words to mean more than one thing. And I do think that there is this kind of drive to kind of have these, to give these kind of semantic discussions kind of more weight really than they should have, even though humans have never learned this and never will learn it. And I won't either. I still get angry, like, what? That's not a fill in the blank. But then like 4 hours later, I like wake up and I'm like, I'm so stupid, right? So like, who cares, right? But so I think there's a value to jargon, but I think a lot of it depends on the community and what the language is intended for, right? So for me, as we move forward, and from my perspective as a developer, going from a more experimental space to a more commercial space, I think at a company that is very interested in reaching these wider audiences who may not demand the kind of gaminess that sort of like a hardcore audience would traditionally demand. This becomes an increasingly important problem, right? And I think having stuff like Proteus be considered a game, and here's something that I have to confess is like I actually don't find the Arrestor that interesting because I actually really like games with complex systems in them. But the fact that game got the award and the fact that it opens the door and just like poses the question of like, no, hey, games can be more than that, I think is phenomenally useful, and I think this is good for everybody. Because it's not just about games and not games, it's just the idea of being able to reconfigure what you think a game is. So it's not just about games versus the Arrestor, it's about games versus any other kind of innovative content on any other kind of axis that we think we want to push for. So for me, this is fantastic, and I think that if in the future, the word game ends up incorporating, I don't know, any kind of digital media or even storytelling, and we end up deciding that stories are really just systems anyway, so game becomes like our only word for media or something in the future, which I'm sure would anything. Games are just everything. It's like I'm gonna go get a game. This is a game. I had a game for breakfast. Yes, it would be. Right? Or yeah, exactly. Or it's a catch-all for I don't know, like it's a euphemism for bad language or whatever. Anyway, so yeah, so I think that as we move forward, this is something that people seem very concerned about, and I think that there's a reason to be concerned about it, but I also think you just can't fight culture, and I do think that this is becoming very serious, not just for artistic reasons, but for audience reasons, and I think that the way that markets are going and the way that new technologies are having to, the way that we're having to rethink, what games are just from a market point of view. It's like I know that hardcore developers who are like, oh, the iPad is ridiculous. It's like, well, guess what? Everybody may be developing for the iPad in the future. So when you consider stuff like that, I think these questions become enormously important. And I think that if we don't redefine what a game is, other people are going to redefine it for us. So you can be on the mountaintop screaming, this is what you didn't mean forever, while the tides of culture swallow you. So anyway, so that's it for me.
So I think I'll ask like one or two questions before we open it up to the floor. So I guess like one thing that struck me was that in a way I think when we asked this kind of talk about like these things that we get distributed alongside other games that we may not for some reason consider games like Proteus, it's very easy to think of it as being this kind of, it's this kind of like the kind of crazy independent experimental avant-garde. I don't know, did anybody go to GDC where somebody shouted at, you're not even making real games? Does somebody know who I'm talking about? So this was a singer, Mike Pincus was on stage, rather than actually a very angry person in the crowd shouted like, you're not even making real games. I think that's what's kind of interesting. Like it both has this kind of experimental avant-garde, like for a small audience aspect to it, but it's also something that seems to be happening with like the broadening of the audience in the complete opposite, like so super, very clearly commercial direction, and which also causes all kinds of kind of anger issues as well. But I actually wanted to ask you just like do a kind of concrete question to all of you, which was that. In your kind of design practice or in your work, like what is it about games that the idea of games that you find most limiting? So I think there's a certain tendency to say the bad thing about games is the kind of player optimization. So there's a certain idea that it's because you have the goals and the player spends all this energy optimizing in relation to the goals, and the players don't care about the story, or they don't care about like the kind of environment they're in, or they don't care about like the kind of beauty of the social interaction or the beauty of the movement and so on. Is that like the sticking point? Do you think that if you think of what is limiting about games, is there like a particular sticking point for you in terms of from a kind of design or from your perspective? Just wanted to do a kind of round.
This is
pedantic answer, but I don't even agree with the formulation of the question.
Okay.
Because you're again, to go back to my lecture, you're like focusing too much on the object. I think what frustrates me the most about making games is exactly like the contextual issues.
But something,
So it's not that like games are interactive and it's like difficult to like retain control of the players with algorithms or something. It's more like I'm operating in a particular like commercial context that has like opportunities and real limitations for what I can do. And again, this is both good and bad, that there is like a certain audience, or actually a series of audiences around there, you know, and not even commercially, but like artistically, that like my peers, like, you know, some stuff is relevant, some stuff is not relevant. So like those like socio-cultural, contextual constraints that I think is both the amazing / frustrating.
Okay, but again, I mean, it does actually answer the question, right? Because what you're saying in a way is that what's limiting about the idea of games is that you're thinking you're just designing this thing, and that the thing is it, right? In a way, that's what you're saying, right?
Well, but also that there are actually contextual constraints, I mean, in terms of like what work is going to get commercially successful, or what work will be like relevant to my indie peers out there.
And so, Annika?
Well, since I'm sort of designing stuff that goes outside the scope already, it's hard to talk about what's limiting with the scope that I'm not using. But I think I sort of struggle with the same thing as you do, that I get the gamers in. I get players that have preconceived notions of what they should be expecting. And I have to sort of somehow guide them, instruct them, prohibit them sometimes from doing what they expect them to do. So I'm struggling with the concept of game from the perspective that you're not actually going to be doing what you think you will be doing.
From my perspective, the biggest challenge is not players, but other developers, or when you're on a large team collaborating. I find myself in constant arguments about what is a game and what is not a game, just because there are various definitions that just I think people work with, but they don't really articulate clearly, right? Like, so some people might think it's not a game unless we can somehow attach achievements to it, and some people might think that it's not a game unless it has a very specific type of like philosophy towards like a difficulty curve, or it's not a game if it doesn't have a difficulty curve, or it's not a game if difficulty ramps in a certain way. Difficulty is kind of a sticking point for me because it's something people are very concerned with. It's like people are very concerned with the game being too hard or too easy. And I do think that there are certain things about things that have become connected with a fundamental definition of what a video game is in commercial video game development culture that are not necessarily connected, and sometimes it's very hard to actually even talk about what a game is without getting mixed up in some of these things. And difficulty is the main one I can think of right now.
So I'll just ask you. So that's a cool thing, right? I can kind of do this like a blocking now. Yeah. No, so I was thinking that in a way it's like, I think like it's kind of very easy to have this kind of positive message that it's so great that Proteus and so on is included and so on. But I mean, so I guess I always personally struggle with my kind of desire to be a snob and my desire to be inclusive, right? So in a way that games I really hate, and then I also like want to be a person who kind of understands what other people are playing, and so it's kind of tricky. But so as you're saying, like there's something nice about Proteus winning an award and so on. But say, why does somebody like if for some kind of weird political reason, like Microsoft Office 2013 got entered into IGF and actually won like the design award, like would you? I mean, so isn't that even like I'm just like pointing to like it does seem that even now, though we're talking in this kind of very inclusive sense, my sense is that there's certain things you wouldn't consider a game or wouldn't consider relevant to the category of games. So I'm just like asking, where is that limit? Isn't there still some kind of limit?
Well, personally, I'm pretty inspired by Dave Hickey has this great book called Air Guitar. It's like a series of essays, and for Hickey, art, for example, is a democracy. What he means by that is that like what we define by art is a bunch of different constituencies lobbying for like the stuff that they support. And actually art is just a fucking battle. It's a fucking game of standing up for what you think is art. And that's both, like democracy, that's both great and awful. Like, it's great because you've got kind of a personal investment and it's kind of culture deciding. It's awful because sometimes you come this close to fucking electing Mitt Romney or something. Right? So, like, I mean, it's good and bad, right? We could lose that election and Microsoft Office could be the IGF design, and like that would suck. But like, or I think so. No offense to Microsoft people out there, but like, you know, this is an election battle that we are going to continue fighting. Like, that's culture, right?
Yeah. So the other panelists, you have
Well, as I said, I did write a paper on defining games. So in some sense, I think it makes sense to keep some kind of concept of what a game actually is. I think the reason is because we need a language. We need a language to talk about the kind of expertise that goes into building games. It sort of works as a music score. Once we define what music score is, we know how to write music. But then as soon as we do that, we're going to feel constricted. So then we'll say, okay, but what if we can actually have 6 lines instead of 5 lines? And somebody actually does that and writes music in a different way. So it's like creating a scaffolding that we then can break.
Is this an answer to the Microsoft question? Like, how would I feel if that happened?
Yeah, no, it's not about so it's great to say that we're kind of inclusive, we want all kinds of like different experiences, but my hunch is that nobody actually wants Microsoft Office to be the idea.
It would be like conceptual art though, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would. Oh yeah, no, yeah, I agree. So
Can you imagine an exhibition where Microsoft
yeah, sure. Yeah, so it's like playing Desert Bus or something. Yeah, this kind of a celebration of futility.
Yeah. Well, are you saying that like, do we need to have a line somewhere?
Yeah. No, did you feel like you still, if I give you that example, do you still feel the need for a line anyway? Or?
I think there probably should be a line somewhere, but I think that, you know, I guess like negotiating that line is also part of the process. So I think that we need to define not just the line, but I think more importantly, I think we need to define what our strategy for negotiating it is, right? Just even having a clear concept that it is a negotiated thing. You know, because I think it's not so much the line moves, but I think the concept of negotiation is something that we seem spotty on, just as a culture. So.
But I mean, you could just say like that actually, regardless how you define a game, you could also actually say that the definition is actually about what a player expectation is.
Well, yeah.
So in a way, it's not necessarily like when you define things in this kind of very dry, semantic way. It doesn't mean that it's not related to kind of culture or expectation.
No, but I think too, like, this is also a remembered conversation, but I feel like sometimes what makes something feel like it belongs in a certain label in our mind is because it fits like enough of the important information points of a pattern. So like, I wonder if people would think Dear Esther or Proteus were games if they didn't actually use the conventions of an FPS. You know, because I think that they use that as an interface convention, but they lack other things that you would associate with the game. So there's a lot of, like game, it's almost like if it's the interface of a game, but not the rule structure of a game, it's still enough of a game that it like ticks that switch in our minds.
Yeah, so it was just like a Microsoft Office document.
But I think
so I think we should open it up to the floor.
I think Wittgenstein is right on that. Like, I think it is difficult to come up with an exhaustive, but certainly, right, like, there's a reason that Proteus was up for IGF and not, like, whatever, a new novel or something that somebody wrote. And because there are kind of some, like, you know, and again, it's also a historical framing thing. Like, it's obviously a statement as well about, like, well, let's take the first-person shooter experience and strip it down. Like, explicitly for Dan Pinchbeck, right? That is the research experiment behind Dear Esther. So it is also in dialogue with that. So it's like, you know, there are obviously some intersection points, and I think that is a useful exercise to now, hey, let's look at Dear Esther, let's take a more traditional game, let's think about what they have in common, what they don't have. But what I'm saying is like Matt pointed, it is a negotiation, and for different people, like that line happens at different kind of intersection areas. So.
Yeah, Richard?
Well, I wanted to just kind of jump off Doug's remark about video games being this portmanteau word, which I think is just a neat solution to the problem. A hat stand, a hat stand isn't made of hats, but it's conceptually related to hats, and I think that video games stand in a similar kind of relation to games. So for me, that the semantics aren't that problematic. But what I wanted, what was that?
You hang games on them?
Maybe. No, you don't. But I wanted to jump up to Matt's remark about FPSs in a way. Frank last night put me on to this remark of Gabe Newell's about Half-Life, where he says, Half-Life in many ways was a reactionary response to the trivialization of the experience of the first-person genre. Many of us had fallen in love with video games because of the phenomenological possibilities of the field. And we felt like the industry was reducing the experiences to least common denominators. Our hope was that building worlds and characters would be more compelling than building shooting galleries. And that seems important in this context. I worked on a sequence of gameplay in Uncharted, this peaceful village sequence where we broke up the rhythms of the shooting gameplay and created this people remarked on this quite profound emotional moment by just taking away all of the game-like stuff and leaving the aesthetics and the atmosphere. So, what do you guys think about this? Is this like phenomenology? It seems related to your remarks, Doug, like the philosophical movement away from Cartesian objects of thought and towards consciousness as process?
Well, I mean, just to jump in, I think it's a great quote. I mean, of course, I like shooting galleries as well.
Yeah,
so it's not that like point is not that like fuck your traditional games. Like they're all going to be Proteus from now on. Like the point is diversity. Like I want to on Tuesday fucking murder as many people online as possible, and then on Wednesday like go off on a Proteus adventure. Right. So it's diversity.
I don't understand the question. So
Well, I guess because I thought this related to what you were saying
Yeah.
as well, Annika.
I think it does, but I don't understand it. So.
Are we moving with this move towards not games, towards more experiential games? Does this reflect a shift away from thinking of the world in terms of objects, in terms of counting things? And like it seems like if I'm in the middle of a game of basketball, I don't really have time to reflect on the nature of my consciousness because I'm too busy using the mechanisms of consciousness to score points and to traverse the world. Is this a shift towards a more kind of reflective game player? As represented in these new kinds of games that are emerging? And these new game opportunities like pervasive games?
I would say that it's more a hunt for different experiences. So maybe not just reflection, but a couple of different experiences that a game doesn't necessarily provide. So if you have a very goal-oriented game, the kinds of emotions that's going to elicit have something to do with the goal. So maybe it falls somewhere in a spectrum of being really frustrated because I can't reach the goal and I need to try once more to, oh wow, I'm all empowered and I did a good job for the world and I saved Hyrule or whatever. And if you want to move out of that spectrum, then you have to look for other things to do in the game to at all be able to generate other kinds of things like love or deep connection feelings.
Yeah.
So I think it's more that we are trying to move out of there, and that's definitely true for pervasive games and LARP, that they are trying to move for a richer spectrum of emotions.
Right. Yeah. That's kind of what I have in mind. I didn't realize you worked on the Snowfield. I played that recently and enjoyed it a lot.
Oh, it was, and it's funny to talk about these formal conventions too, because we, at some point, it was originally first person, but then we had the third person character there because we needed a way to show that you're cold, that you're freezing. So, but we had this offset camera, and somebody, it wasn't intentional, but somebody commented like, oh, there's a commentary on Gears of War because it's the same camera angle, like an offset character. I was like, wow, we didn't intend that, but sure, I'll say that. That's great. But no, but I think that it illustrates a point. I do think that we do need new sets of formal conventions that allow us to express all sorts of things. But I do think that because video games have such a strong set of formal conventions that anytime you do something that is a non-game or something ideologically very opposed to traditional games, but use those formal conventions, like do something like Dear Esther, but have it control like an FPS, you're inevitably commenting on FPSs every time you do that. And I think that one of the reasons why you have stuff like Spec Ops: The Line, and it's like really easy to like take, one of the easiest ways to kind of do commentary in video games right now is just to take existing ideologically loaded formal conventions or narrative conventions of games and just like, you know, just comment on them by subverting them, right? You know, yeah. And I think that there's some really awesome examples of that, but we can't just do only that. But I think because we're now at this crossroads, that's an interesting thing that tends to be happening right now. But we obviously need to move beyond that as well, I think. Not everything can be a parody of, you know, Halo.
So this is a sort of a question. I want to get your reaction to this thought. So everything that I've heard you talk about has existed since the beginning of games, right? The role-playing things have been around there. The 3D worlds that you wander around, I distinctly remember at SIGGRAPH wandering around these beautiful 3D worlds and clicking on things and having cool little sounds appear. All this stuff has been around since the beginning. However, there was a dark time where consoles took over, first-person shooters dominated, action games, and people were spending billions of dollars as platform owners to define a product to sell to us. And most of the people here who are below a certain age of range, their only experience has been basically growing up within this marketing dictatorship. And I wonder if perhaps this explosion of, oh my God, what the hell are we doing with ourselves, is due to the wall coming down. And suddenly we're like, we've been sold this story of what video game is, which is a term I despise. And now we're like, wait, there's all these other possibilities, which were there all along. It's just that we were consuming somebody else's propaganda. What's your reaction to that thought?
I mean, it may be a little overstated. Like, it definitely resonates, and I'm sure that's part of it. But to me, though, it's not just like a commercial thing. Like, again, I would point to IF as, and I'm sure someone here could mount a good argument for why maybe IF isn't like quite a good fit for games or something. But I think that is like just an example of something within the more artistic or the independent community.
Did they self-identify themselves?
Yeah.
Like that? Or they did
They
explicitly
themselves.
the community
Yeah,
itself?
they call themselves interactive.
I think
Yeah,
it's
they called themselves interactive culture, and they decided to make that distinction.
Well, I think it's.
And also it existed for a very long time as like an indie community, like non-commercial.
Is Emily Short here? By the way, she was here last year. But yeah,
It's like I have comment.
we love IF, and IF is always welcome to practice.
The investment community is a bit split about whether they're making games or not. Some of us consider what we do games, others want to call it electronic literature, but they're not probably uncomfortable with being called games because it's part of, we're trying to reach the same, like a similar audience, maybe more niche or whatever, but it's not that it's an uncomfortable label after all.
Well, I mean, it's got to be a two-way street. Like, you know, obviously, if they want to say like, no, actually, like, we don't want to play your game, we're doing our thing. But I think based on some of the people I talk to, there are some people who do want to play that game, but they are like kind of like left out a little bit. For example, I'm saying all I can do is like stand up for like my own personal definition of games, and I play some really amazing IF pieces, and I'm like, man, like these could really sit really well together with. You know, the other games we're showing at IndieCade, and you know, IndieCade does show IF sometimes, and I think that's really great.
But it's kind of interesting. Perhaps they just don't want to talk to us like so much, right? So it's not that they actually don't want to be included.
Right, I mean, it's just it's not mysterious. And sure, maybe there's a little bit, but there's a very simple explanation, which is that they consciously call themselves.
Some of them. All right, so question there.
So the fact that like there's disagreement about whether or not interactive fiction authors want to be called games, I think is kind of interesting. I think it just kind of points out the whole idea that
it just does come down to using a buzzword that you think enough people will latch onto, right? And people who use the term interactive fiction are commonly saying it's like a game but very, very different from other games. It focuses on the fiction. It's intentionally separating it from other types of games in the hopes that that will resonate with lots of people who say, games, I hate those. I want fiction. If you guys think that this is like malleable, that the word game is malleable enough to include all those things, what's your ideal vision of the future? A little practically, how do you think we could actually get to that point where enough human beings are willing to consider those more malleable definitions of the word and not need a term like interact, or not need to hear this is a console game instead of a social game or a mobile game? Because they're all the same problem, right? They're all very weighted and very loaded words.
Well, like I said, I think you could have some olive branches, like give more opportunity, because there are people. I don't think the independent games community tends to focus on some aspects of games, like writing, for example. So I think branching out and offering the right curatorial venues for that stuff would be a great start, right? For like targeting certain people on the periphery of games and saying, hey, this stuff is interesting. Let's look at it. But you're right. It is like a tactical discussion. There's a very reasonable counter argument to what I'm saying, which is like, listen, this isn't the right tactical move for interactive fiction. Actually, we like having this term, and I think there's definitely a super reasonable objection to what I'm saying. But I think it is a discussion of strategy and tactics and like how do we want to associate ourselves.
I think Eric was
I also, just to build on what Dan's sort of historical comments, I don't know, as someone who has been working in the game industry for almost 20 years, I mean, I see an explosion of forms of digital games now. I don't see an oppressive authority that's sort of restraining things. I see all these venues for digital distribution and festivals and exhibitions and things like that. So I see it as a kind of Cambrian explosion for things that are sort of games or not games. And the other thing I wanted to say is that there's a lot of interesting pre-digital historical precedents, obviously, for things that are not games, besides just play in general, which is a huge category of stuff which kind of can gradually drift into games or not games. But just to take an obvious example, like Fluxus, artists, mostly in the 70s, made things that are, I always see Fluxus games, and it's funny, as a game designer, you'll go to them and they're like, okay, rules for, properly living in your apartment or something, and it'll say like, every morning when you get up, clap your hands 2,000 times to do this, and so that's like a stupid made up example, but they sort of create rules of behaviors or rules of interaction with people or things that look like games. But the funny thing is that none of them actually work as games in a classical sense. That most of them are meant to break down. And I think what's interesting is that they often are, the rules of a game or the rules of a proper game stand in for the rules of proper behavior or thinking or politics or conceptions of reality or what have you. So then by putting these playful games that sort of themselves break in order to bring down the rules of authority, as a game designer, it's not really my cup of tea, but it's an interesting move as a cultural work. So what I find, one of the things that I find that I think the people that are sort of not games or self-consciously doing not games, that I feel like could be more expansive, it's almost as if often it's like they're carving out a little loyal opposition space for them. Well, they're going to define themselves in opposition to the oppressive hegemony of what are considered games, and define the identity of the sorts of work that they do in opposition to games, which I feel is sort of kind of limiting, because then unless you're like deep into the sort of subcultures of games and not games, and mostly designers or hardcore subcultural players, that's sort of less relevant to culture at large. So I wonder if there are things more like the Fluxus idea where we're playing with things that might be on the borders of games and not games, but it's not so obsessed with commenting on exactly what conventions and genres were here and there at certain times and arguing over semantics. So, and I don't know where that would take us, but it often seems like what the panel's about, not games, are so much, there's a sort of incestuousness about their relationship to games as a whole.
I think I need to comment on that because when we started to look at, I mean, the term basic games is from 2001, so it's like really, really recent. And then we started to look at the historic, and this turns out to be something that people have been doing over and over again, like it's been reinvented. So first we thought that Marino Invisible Theatre from the 40s might have been the first. Oh yeah, but then we had Queen Elizabeth in the 15th century, or 16th century, so those masquerades were actually for basic games. And I mean, and then the earliest were Egypt 2000 before Christ or something like that. Like, so I don't think that we're doing anything that's new. And in particular, I think that all of those forms have not been seen as games, but they have had very many of the same properties as games. So I think you're right. I think that when we take this discussion to this table, we see it becomes very incestuous. One of the problems, I get much more frustrated. What do you say? I would like to rant about the term real gamer. Because I turn into that when I read articles about new games and they say, so this is a game for real gamers, or sometimes they're called hardcore gamers and so on. And it's that keeps us gatekeeping this to be real games. Real gamers play real games in some sense, and that we need to get out of that discourse, I think.
But Aaron, just to your point, I guess to try to phrase more cogently what I've been trying to say. Like, I think Dear Esther is a great success story where you could argue where Dan utilized the gaming community, the gaming press, the gaming distribution mechanism. He really embraced the gaming frame, and as a result, got his games to like thousands of people. It is totally mind-blowing how many people on Steam have gotten Dear Esther, right? Like, this is weird, like, experimental thing, and now like it blew up on Steam. So I think that's tactically big success for where Dan has leveraged this social world to get like wider exposure for that weird thing. So I think that is a cool example of really embracing the term, because there is this existing machinery of this game world, whether, I mean, it does come with a lot of problems as well, but it can be utilized really well to get your game out there, which is, arguably is a really positive thing.
So, Annika, you said that when people talk about games and defining games, they have an agenda, and I agree. I think that's true, but I also think that not all agendas are equally valid. Like, I think some agendas are better than others for our purposes as game designers. I do a lot of stuff about trying to find words that are really useful for game designers. And when I say game, I mean something very narrow and very specific for the explicit purpose of so that we can create like guidelines and stuff like. So if we know game is this, like, oh, it's this, okay. Now we can like start making rules about how to make that better. Whereas if game is this, kind of all-inclusive thing, where I mean, both you, also Doug, you said something like, if Proteus isn't a game, I don't want to be a part of this situation. And like, I don't think that's a good reason for I don't think that's like a strong way to use words, because if words are based on our personal preferences, then they become less useful, because words are inherently things that we share, that we use to express ideas to other people. And if it's like, I like an apple, and you hand me an apple, and I'm like, I like to call watermelons apples. So, it's like we're creating barriers between ourselves and other people when we use our own personal. So that's kind of my comment, is that I think there's a specific type of machine, and for the designers of that kind of machine, they need like really clear words. For people who you guys are talking about like marketing and culture and how games have this cultural value and we want to tap into that. I think that might be what you guys kind of meant, is that like there's this video game culture and we want to tap into that and be a part of that. And that's why I want, LARPing to be considered games, or, Dear Esther to be considered games. That's fine, and you could maybe do that, but the word game already has tons of definitions, and I would just say that there's a specific type of, for game designers, for mechanical game designers or whatever, they might have a different definition for games than someone else, and I think that's okay. I would just say that my comment is just that not all agendas are equally
Well, but
useful.
But like, how do we rank agendas? I mean, the whole point is like, I have a personal opinion about what the definition of game is. Like, either culture is going to tell me to sit the fuck down, or like, you know, luckily, like it seems like, you know, given the success, luckily for me, given the success of Dear Esther and Proteus, it seems like that definition is in these days in this scene expanding a little bit. So like, this is like a good development for me personally.
People are referring to that as not games, right? Isn't this not game movement? Doesn't
That's a
sort of
rhetorical stance, though. I don't think you need to worry about semantic drift because everything is solved by context. And that's Wittgenstein's. So you're all right. You and your friends know what you're talking about when you say game. And when we're talking about Proteus, it's all right. We can still call it a video.
And just a quick comment. That's exactly what I meant when I said that we need a language because it works as a scaffolding.
Yeah.
But when you have the scaffolding, you will also see what falls between the cracks, and then you will start to revolt against it. And that's a super important next step. So the scaffolding gives you a structure, but then you start to see, okay, can I do something differently? Does this really fit? And that's a really important part of defining stuff, finding the cracks.
Shoshana?
So sort of riff off of what you're saying, I think it's so separating to talk about, you know, games in such a specific way, because what you just said actually was completely discounting of, like, LARP has been here. we haven't been anywhere else, and so I'm a LARP designer, and to say to talk about it from a perspective of, well, this is the fundamental mechanic way to go after design, would be to discount an entire tradition that's been there for longer.
Call it something else.
Well, sure, but let's call it something else. But we're doing the exact same thing. We define things on the same rules that game design does for video games, and we've been doing the same thing for tabletop aspects. There are core mechanical discussions that could be shared between everyone that could improve each of the different aspects of game design, whether or not you're talking about interactive fiction or LARP or tabletop or digital design. And by separating everybody into these separate groups, we're not learning from one another, and we never will. And I mean, if we wanted to talk about traditions here, like LARP has been around since Queen Elizabeth's time. There's a lot to learn there, and any language that's going to separate us is going to discount great art.
So I would say I'm really happy with this discussion, the spirited discussion that's happening right now, and I too really like the agenda way of thinking about this thing. And I think one of the things that bothers me about, I think there's a little bit of bad faith that happens on both sides in this argument. And I think partly it's because people use an argument about a definition to avoid being honest about what they're really saying. What's really going on in many of these conversations is a jockeying for status, a jockeying for position, an exercise of authority, who's included, who isn't, and more importantly, because all of that is maybe something that we don't want to say that we do, although we all do it, but we don't like it, we don't want to say we do it. But it's also an abdication of the responsibility to make claims about your own preferences and judgments about taste. And when you're making a judgment about taste, you then have to back it up, and you have to persuade people, and you have to argue people, and you say, this is what I like, this is what I want more of. I want more people to make games like this, I want more people to make less games like this, or I want to play more games like this, or I think these games are actually better than these other games. So, for example, in the not games movement, it's not simply because really, if it was just a matter of inclusion, who cares? Do whatever you want. Everybody, do what you want. Make the games you want. I want everyone to make the games they want and do the things they want, regardless of what they're called. But that's not what's going on.
Even if they word processors.
In the not games movement, there is actually part of that rhetoric that happens from people like Miguel Sicard, to a certain degree, yourself, Doug, and David Kanega, and certainly the Telltales people, is that it is a critique of competitive games, of the restrictions of rules-based games, of goal-based games, and sometimes a very strenuous critique, a very harsh critique of min-maxers and poop sockers and cat-assers and the people who want to demean themselves.
Real gamers.
Demean themselves. But it's a harsh critique of a thing that I find deeply, profoundly moving and beautiful. At the same time, many people who reject these games like Dear Esther or want to push them out are just narrow-minded, prejudiced, and people whose taste is not evolved and not sophisticated enough to appreciate a flavor beyond the flavor that they currently like, which is goal-directed or whatever. So on both sides, it would be a much better discussion if people just said, no, I don't like that, and here's why. Not who cares what it's called, right? That's my
Frank,
comment.
for the record, I am publishing a collection of very competitive min-max games.
Yes.
So I don't think it applies to.
Yeah. And I love this argument.
And
Don't
you
get me
can
wrong.
support it on Kickstarter, actually.
I wonder if you guys have any thoughts about the sort of utility of these types of definitions for various institutions. Frank's touching on the importance of these things from an individual perspective, as we're like individuals are jockeying for status and power. But we have the academy, we have like giant corporations making games, we have groups of individuals. Certainly groups of individuals are probably best helped by broader discourse, more people talking to each other. But the academy, for example, if games lean too much towards art, do we get a games department anymore? Within Steam is a particular thing. If I buy a game and it's really not a game on Steam and it's this other thing and I don't like that, how does that change my perspective on future things I'm going to buy? So I'm just curious if you have more thoughts about the institutional roles of definitions for games.
That's a super good concern. Yeah, I've been talking about this.
I would say that if games were art, I would have gotten my productions funded from the arts community in Sweden, which would have been great.
I guess that's just mostly my point, right? These words actually are form institutions. One of your arguments was like it's about being an IGF. It's about in traditional like the 2002 version of this debate, ludology, narrativology, right? Like that's like film studies versus more traditional art or study of play as the place where games are going to live in the academy. I think that all of these elements of the conversation are sort of implicit in it, and I feel like I want to talk about what the words actually do for us as individuals. A pretty heterogeneous group of game makers. Yeah. Like they have value for us in different ways that I think is also being jockeyed for in these conversations.
Matt, I think that's sort of the flip side of what Frank is saying as a judgment of taste. Then the institutions make judgments of taste, and it basically affects people's careers and livelihoods, right? Yeah. Can you get into the festival? Can you get it? Can you get an arts grant? Can you teach somewhere doing this thing? So I think it's sort of connected to this whole idea.
I guess like a personal comment. I do think that there's also like when we talk about this, like the definitions and our personal interests and so on. I mean, sometimes I think we can also overstate how much power we have. Right? So I can write all the papers I want defining games, but if somebody doesn't really kind of influence consumer X all that much, so if you pick up a box that says game versus it doesn't say game, that's actually going to mean something to them, right? So I guess there's heterogeneous messy and so on. But something like I think we have room for one question. So perhaps two. Yeah, Sean.
Well, it was more just a comment. Like, I mean, this seems very cyclical. Like I mean, it's been going on since art. Like everybody's like saying what's art. Like they're still saying what's art. And I mean, I just remember, being young and everyone's like, what the hell is this Mist thing? Like, that's not a game. Like, it's like now then it became like this whole, like, movement. And we're in a place where we're kind of back to first-person games that people are like, these aren't games because they're about the experience. And it's like, that used to be a slideshow, and that's considered like a really influential game. So it's kind of interesting how the conversation just keeps cycling every 20 years. Like, oh, we're going back to the first-person things that are about experience. It's like, is that a game? No, it's not. Yes, it is. It's kind of weird.
But this, that almost gets to the point of again, art or games is democracy, or it gets to Matt's point about at least at least everyone realizing that it is a negotiation, right? Like we're still decades later having discussions about taxes or whatever in America, and there's obviously no right or wrong answer to that. It's just there's a group of people, in this case American citizens, in politics, who are all kind of jockeying for, again, that's both good and bad. But as a developer, I guess what I was trying to show in my lecture is that there's actually, this isn't just an academic discussion. There's parts where where you realize this and you can target certain contexts or avoid certain contexts, where that becomes a really useful practical. So in my case, I've benefited tremendously, personally, from identifying like, yes, this is the community I should do it in. This is the right. Like there's another world in which I make Johann Sebastian Joust as like in custom technology in some sort of research lab. The same exact game is like very different if I had framed it that way than as like PlayStation 3 new controller thing. So all I'm saying is this isn't just an academic discussion. It actually like as a developer that can help or hurt in like really concrete ways.
Oh yeah, I was just commenting on how funny it is. It's just
yeah.
like, I mean, because most people will agree that this is a game in the end, whereas it's like it's very similar to this idea of the experiential first-person game. And it's like, why are we coming? It's like kind of like abortion rights. Why are we digging these back up like 30 years later? Where it's like we already agreed, and now we're disagreeing again. It's kind of strange.
All right, so I think that was the last comment. So thanks a lot to the panel and.